during the pandemic, largely because of Dr. Fauci and others, we began talking about the science, not science as a process to discover where we're wrong so we can grow in our confidence about what we're right, about science as an entity, as a thing, almost as an institution. And Fauci became the science. Dr. Fauci was back in front of Congress. This whole thing has been quite a roller coaster. He's been in front of Congress many times. He has this epic feud with Senator Rand Paul, where Rand Paul is always grilling him and catching him in these little traps. And Rand Paul is a doctor as well, so he knows a lot more about this stuff than the average person like I do. And Fauci became the face of the pandemic response. And yet now, the more we learn about the pandemic response, the more we see that we were quite misguided. And I don't really blame anyone for being misguided early on this thing. It was so new and it really was so terrifying. They were talking about just millions of people dropping dead. Obviously, that didn't happen. And it just felt like we set some pathways in place and then we're too prideful to ever get off of them. In closed door testimony, it came out that some of the protocols, like 6 foot social distancing, that it didn't really have any controlled experimental backing behind it. It was based on studies from decades ago about how far droplets spread, even though COVID wasn't actually passing just through droplets, it was in the air. The efficacy of the masks, all that's been brought into question. Just this week, it has been determined that the COVID vaccine cannot be called a vaccine. Doesn't mean it didn't help some people, just means that it doesn't meet the definition of a vaccine. All of this craziness. And really what people are concerned about is that Fauci covered up the origins or the potential origins of where the virus started. They're concerned that Fauci committed perjury by lying in front of Congress multiple times, specifically about gain of function research. And so he is back in Congress. It's fireworks all over again. Let's look at this report from Politico. Anthony Fauci defends his COVID response, distances himself from advisor accused of misconduct. Anthony Fauci defended his handling of the pandemic in House testimony on Monday while seeking to distance himself from a longtime aide accused of misconduct. Fauci sought to refute allegations from Republicans on the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic that he tried to suppress the theory that a lab accident in Wuhan, China caused the pandemic. He said that the idea is not a conspiracy theory and that he had kept an open mind about how the pandemic started. He has, however, endorsed a theory that the disease came from an infected animal. Fauci insisted that the research his agency funded at the Wuhan Institute could not have created COVID. In the past month, the Department of Health and Human Services has given proponents of the lab leak theory some ammunition by stripping EcoHealth Alliance, the U.S. research group that collaborated on virus studies with Wuhan, and its president, Peter Daszak, of federal funding. The department has threatened to permanently bar both the government grants, alleging they failed to comply with the oversight rules. Some people are even insisting that Fauci should be put in prison, which is a wild accusation, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. It seems like in the course of all of the contention around gain of function research, that on the back end, they kind of subtly, quietly changed the definition of gain of function so they could walk into testimony and say, no, here's our agreed upon definition, and it is slightly different than what we were doing in Wuhan, China.
Wow.
So all of this has everyone up in arms. There are some on the left who are in testimony really defending him, thanking him. Obviously, Fauci became a bit of a saint during the pandemic. I mean, you could buy the prayer candles with Fauci's face on them. He was a celebrity. He was voguing on the front of all these different magazines. What really is the Fauci problem? Part of the problem is that Fauci saw himself as of ultimate importance. And because there were significant mistakes made in the handling of COVID, what you would want is for someone to come out and go, hey, here's the mistakes that were made. We were wrong about this. Really sorry. Did our best here. Thought this was going to happen. Instead, like everything at the political level, everyone has to insulate themselves and never admit defeat. As soon as you admit defeat, you are handing over ammunition to people who want to destroy you. And so you just never apologize. You never admit defeat. And it might be good for you in your political career, but it's terrible for the general population that all of these people are there supposedly to serve. I think the real issue with Fauci comes down to pridefully assuming a position that was not meant for him. And he assumed that position because he did believe that he represented science to everyone else. And I don't just think that, I know that because he told us that.
Is that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, people can recognize there's a person there, there's a face, there's a voice you can recognize, you see him on television. So it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science.
In the name of the Galactic Senate of the Republic, you're under arrest, Chancellor.
Are you threatening me, Master Jedi?
The Senate will decide your fate.
I am the Senate.
Not.
So this person on YouTube clipped in a little part of the Star Wars prequel where Palpatine says, "I am the Senate," the same way that Fauci seemingly correlated himself with the science. The obvious problem with that is that you cannot personify science because science is a process. Science is not a thing. Science is not a proper noun. Science can't be a person, and science can't be represented by a person because that's assuming that that one person perfectly executes every hypothesis through the scientific process, which would, I guess, make them God. I don't know. Science is there to show us how we're wrong. I mean, you start the scientific process with some kind of hypothesis and you test it in some kind of controlled manner, really to find out how wrong am I about this? And the more you can find out by using the scientific process how wrong you are, the closer you can grow to being confident that you're right about something. As you adjust your hypothesis and you try it again, you have a controlled experiment again and again and again. During the pandemic, largely because of Dr. Fauci and others, we began talking about the science, not science as a process to discover where we're wrong so we can grow in our confidence about what we're right, about science as an entity, as a thing, almost as an institution. And Fauci became the science. And so when he spoke, science spoke. Well, that's a real problem because science does not speak. It just doesn't. Science is a process. And to personify science is a massive problem. But because we personified science, which is a leap in arrogance, it's like a professor saying, "I am education." It's like education is a process. It's growing and learning and maturing and being discipled. And I am education. It's like, okay, well then whatever this guy says is correct, right? I am science. And so as the representative of science, whatever he says goes. And we did not approach the pandemic response with any level of like epistemic humility. Like, here's what we think we know. Here's where we're kind of confident. We had to stand like we were sure on everything. When we rolled something out, we said, this will work. You have to wear your mask. If you don't, you're killing people. You know, it's like everything was so based in pride and based in a misplaced position. So why was a scientist the political leader of the pandemic? I think Fauci's biggest problem was pridefully assuming a position that was not meant for him. And I think this is partly Trump's fault as well, because Trump was the leader of the nation and he allowed Fauci and Deborah Birx and the CDC leaders and all of these people to really set agendas and to be the primary mouthpiece for what the response would be. And that's the leader's job. The leader is for the scientist to do science, to go through that process all day, every day, questioning hypothesis, running controlled experiments, getting closer and closer to the truth. And then the leader to come out and lead and stand on the convictions and lead with epistemic humility, say, this is where we think we're at. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the lessons we've learned. We were wrong about this last month. Here's what the data is showing us now. But we couldn't do any of that because the science would come up and would speak. We know this. It's a very famous verse, Proverbs 16:18. Pride comes before destruction, and an arrogant spirit comes before a fall. pride is taking your power and using it in an exploitative way, exploiting your power. And it's hard to not say at some level when you are like voguing on the cover of magazines and people are praying to prayer candles with your face on them, and you are equating yourself with the science. And you have in interviews a massive portrait of yourself behind your desk. It's hard to not see that you have been engrossed in pride. And I think this is why Fauci is living a very difficult life right now. And he assumed a position of leadership that was abdicated to him at some level as well. We should be quick to acknowledge. And anytime you step into a position that isn't really yours, disaster always follows. And we see this. This is why Saul loses his kingdom ultimately in the Old Testament, because he steps in and offers the sacrifices that only the priest can offer. King Uzziah did the exact same thing, was cursed for it. Miriam and Aaron, they tried to usurp Moses' leadership, and Miriam got leprosy because of that. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he was turned into a wild animal. Why? Because of his pride. He stood up and tried to take the place of God. Instead, Jesus said, the greatest among you will be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. In other words, the way up is down. And the way to come crashing down really, really quickly is to try and exploit your way up, to try and pridefully assume a position that was never meant for you. I think that is Fauci's biggest problem. And we'll see the legal implications of that, the social implications of that, the financial implications of that as these things play out. My guess is, like most celebrities and most politicians, nothing will happen to him.
Wow.
But his reputation certainly is hurt. And the way the pandemic was handled, largely under his and others' watch, has put the people in a position where not only are we not ready for the next pandemic, but no one will be willing to be led during that or through that. And that's probably not the best case scenario either. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you are subscribed so you can stay up to date with all new content. And if you want early access, exclusive content, and monthly live Q&As, make sure to check out patreon.com/ClaytonTime.